I was recently reminded of a book whose title and author inspired millions of Americans when it was issued. It was published in 1953 in the midst of the Cold War. And looking around, I see that some of us here are old enough to remember the 1950s. Suspicion and fear governed in international relations. Congressional committees were holding hearings to ferret out supposed communist subversives in government, academia, and the arts. The great powers on either side of the Iron Curtain were busily building up their stockpiles of nuclear weapons under a theory of deterrence, ironically designated mutually assured destruction, or MAD. Meanwhile, American school children like me were practicing duck and cover drills in preparation for the nuclear attack that many believed was inevitable. America's economy was booming, creating a burgeoning middle class, but cultural conformism was growing as well. It was the decade of the man in the gray flannel suit. After World War II, American men and women returned to their pre-war roles. Men out of uniform and back into factories and offices, women out of factories and offices and back into the kitchen. And in the 1950s, the civil rights movement was gaining momentum, forcing the nation to begin to confront its racial injustices. So in that decade of rising international tensions, rapid growth at home, and profound societal changes, this book was a reminder to American citizens of the power that moral courage and political idealism have to advance the common good. The author wrote the book as a call for a renewal of political faith. He also meant it to encourage the nation's elected representatives not to yield to the dictates of special interest groups or to make holding on to their offices their highest priority. The book told the stories of 8 United States senators from across the Republic's history who had put principle above party and idealism above political expediency. It illustrated how the political visions of those men, which they often held at great personal cost, had ennobled the political process and advanced the American ideal. The author was the junior senator from Massachusetts, whose own courage and idealism would come to inspire a generation. John F. Kennedy entitled his book, Profiles in Courage. Courage is one of the four so-called cardinal virtues that have shaped much of Western ethical thought. Aristotle set them out as prudence, justice, temperance, and courage. Prudence, that practical wisdom and good judgment, the ability to size up a situation before you act. Justice, that demand for accountability and fairness in a society. Temperance, balancing our natural emotions, appetites, and ambitions with restraint so that they do not become all-consuming. And courage, that refusal to let fear govern our actions in the face of dangers. These 4 qualities of human thought and action form a kind of quartet of virtues, each voice counterbalancing the others so that we can live honorable and harmonious lives. We need all 4. Prudence without courage becomes timidity. Justice without prudence leads on to zealotry. Temperance without justice becomes passivity. And courage without prudence becomes recklessness. We need all 4, but of the 4, John Kennedy called courage the most admirable of human virtues. But what does courage look like? Well, we might first think of courage in terms of acts of great physical bravery. When hijacked Flight 175 hit the World Trade Center's South Tower, people on the 78th floor sky lobby huddled together, frightened and confused. A man in a red bandana covering his nose and mouth suddenly appeared through the smoke and wreckage. He spoke calmly and guided them to a stairwell, leading them to safety. The man in the red bandana made 3 trips to the sky lobby, saving as many people as he could before the burning building collapsed around him. A few months after 9/11, stories surfaced about the mysterious man wearing the red bandana, and when Allison Crowther read an article about the hero in the New York Times, she realized that the man was her 24-year-old son, Wells. He had carried a red handkerchief, she said, since he was a boy. He worked as an equities trader in the tower, but he was also a volunteer firefighter. His body was recovered in the remains of the stairwell alongside other firefighters who had been heading back up into the tower with the Jaws of Life rescue tool. His physical courage, climbing those stairs again and again, was rooted in a far deeper moral courage, the conviction that the lives of his fellow human beings mattered more than his personal safety. That's true courage. The man in the red bandana courageously raced up a collapsing stairwell, but sometimes just sitting down becomes an act of moral courage. In 1955, 1 year before John Kennedy published Profiles in Courage, a young woman boarded a bus in Montgomery, Alabama, and sat down. When the driver ordered her to give up her seat so that a man could sit down in her place, she refused to move. The man was white, she was black. Now, this was no chance event. She had boarded that bus and chosen that seat deliberately, knowing that her refusal to yield could result in her arrest or worse. And by simply sitting down and refusing to get up, Rosa Parks became an exemplar of moral courage that would fire the Montgomery bus boycott and launch a new phase of the civil rights movement. 4 years later, on a hot July day in Greensboro, North Carolina, Joseph McNeil, Franklin McCain, Ezell Blair Jr., and David Richmond, 4 black freshmen at North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University, walked into the downtown Woolworth store and sat down at the lunch counter. Each young man asked to be served a cup of coffee with cream on the side and a donut. The white waitress refused. The white manager demanded that they leave. The young men refused to get up, and they stayed until the store closed for the night. The next day, more than 20 young black adults sat at that counter. Courage is contagious. The courage of those 4 young men inspired a wave of lunch counter sit-ins across the South, and a section of that counter and the 4 stools on which those courageous young men sat is now on permanent display at the Smithsonian Institution. For Rosa Parks and for those 4 young men, simply sitting down and refusing to get up became acts of singular moral courage that inspired many others to act, often at risk to themselves. Courage is contagious. The righteousness of their cause and the courage in acting added momentum to the movement for racial justice and equal rights across the nation. More recently, a week and a half ago, a group of witnesses stood up before a battery of cameras in a vaulted hearing room in Washington, D.C., raised their right hands and swore an oath to tell the truth, and then sat down before the House Select Committee investigating the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. Some of you may have watched those hearings. They ranged from former Justice Department officials to the Republican Speaker of the Arizona House of Representatives to a local polling place worker from Georgia. They testified to the pressure, intimidation, and outright threats they had endured for their refusal to abandon their principles and the oaths they had taken to the Constitution. And on last Tuesday, a 25-year-old young woman, Cassidy Hutchinson, an aide to the former president's chief of staff, courageously testified about the president's conduct in the days surrounding the January 6th attack on the Capitol. Someone has said that moral courage is the bridge between talking about values and actually implementing them. All of these individuals had the courage to walk across that bridge and turn their values into action. Now, you and I may never be called upon to show courage in the face of physical danger or risk harassment and arrest or have our decision to do what is right examined under the harsh spotlight of public scrutiny, but all of us can practice a kind of everyday courage. It begins with our resolve not to let fear or discouragement have the last word. And that's no easy task right now, I know, when the newspaper and the television and the internet give us so many reasons to be discouraged and afraid. Everyday courage is knowing that each morning we will have to confront some of the same troubles and challenges we faced yesterday, but we still got out of bed. Everyday courage is acknowledging that not all our hopes may ever be realized, and yet we still hold on to hope. Everyday courage is choosing to believe in love even when our hearts are broken. Everyday courage is knowing that our dreams for a more just and loving world may be far from coming true, but we still dare to dream. As poet Marianne Rodmacher put it, courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes courage is a little voice at the end of the day that says, "I'll try again tomorrow." Putting that kind of courage into action comes down to some pretty basic things, I think. We can build up the world's stockpiles of grace and goodwill through daily deeds of kindness and generosity. We can use our voices and our votes to make our society safer so that this generation of school children can stand up and look up in hope, not duck and cover under their desks in fear. We can speak up for every person's right to be who they are and not to be bullied, shamed, or erased. We can acknowledge the injustices and injuries of our nation's past and the lingering scars of racism and work to build a more just and loving society. And especially right now, we can stand against every calculated curtailment of human rights and the liberty of conscience. Our world today has more than enough of ideological myopia and blind fanaticism, and those things are rooted in fear, not in courage. We need people of true courage and clear moral discernment now more than ever. We need people who will speak inconvenient truths to those in power who make war and foster injustice and despoil the natural world. Faith communities like yours and mine everywhere need men and women of true courage who will make no peace with oppression or substitute political dogma, right or left, for the deepest convictions of their faith. That kind of courage begins when people of faith take a clear-eyed look at the measure of their own lives in the light of the convictions they profess, and then to take the next courageous step to practice empathetic courage toward those whose beliefs and actions seem far from their own. This is more important now, I think, than ever before in our divided society. We need people with empathetic courage, to be willing to listen and seek to understand the context of another person's beliefs and actions, to understand what the world looks like through their eyes, especially when we find it difficult to accept. It takes courage to step outside our own view of things, to put ourselves in another's place, to seek to understand the hopes and dreams they have for themselves, their families, and their nation, as well as the fears and struggles they face in their lives, just as we do in ours. We need people with the courage not simply to write off those with whom they disagree. We need people with the courage to build bridges, not walls. We need that kind of people. We need to be that kind of people. The Reverend Dr. Barbara Wells Tenhove, Minister Emerita at Cedars UU Church on Bainbridge Island in Washington, wrote this: "We need to ask ourselves, will I be able to show moral courage when necessary?" She writes, "I like to think that if the need arises, we will be able to respond to it, but I also believe we can't do it alone." She added, "We need to trust each other. We need to know that the values we affirm are shared by others, knowing that others share our deep-seated belief in the dignity of human life and the sacredness of creation. We can feel strong and capable, even if circumstances demand that we act alone." Now, I know your congregation very well after all these years, and I know that you and I are fortunate to be members of communities of courage, grounded in our spiritual traditions. And at their best, both your faith tradition and mine call us to practice courageous spirituality, to value questions as much as answers, to seek greater understanding, and to concede that however strong our convictions may be, we do not have a corner on the truth. It takes courage to acknowledge that there is genuine mystery in the universe and realities that exceed the grasp of our rational minds. To recognize that, as one New Testament writer said, faith without works is dead. Put that another way, the vows we make, the principles we profess, must always spur us on to action, because principles without practice will not change the world. Spiritual courage causes us to adopt an intentional spirituality rather than a passive one. You worship on this beautiful hilltop in Marin. How lucky you are to have this spot. My congregation worships in a beautiful Gothic revival building in the heart of San Francisco. In both this place and that place, we profess our belief in the dignity of human beings and the supremacy of love, and we listen to the call to make the world a more just and humane place. At the end of the Sunday service where I worship, before we step out onto Van Ness Avenue, we ask God to send us out to do the work you have given us to do, to love and serve with gladness and singleness of heart. At the close of your services here, as we will do this morning, before you head back down the hill, you sing "Circle Round for Freedom, Circle Round for Peace." Both the prayer that we pray and the song that you sing call us to engage the world courageously. So let us embrace the courage to live every day as if our lives matter, because they do. Let us live every day as if our faith matters, because it does. Let us live every day as if we can make a difference in the world, because we can. Let us be profiles in courage. Amen.